Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Antone, and I'm the Senior Marketing and Events Coordinator at MAR, as well as the producer of our free webinar series. Our webinar today is Website Compliance. This webinar will review how to check your website for compliance, some easy tips to fix the most common challenges, and the business benefits of having an accessible website. After our live session, the webinar will be recorded and added to our website at marealtor.com. If you have any questions throughout the session, please type them in the bottom of the chat box on your screen, and we'll hold a Q&A afterward. Our presenter today is Rebecca Breeden. As fusionSpan's Director of Digital Strategy, Becky works with clients to transform their thinking and approach to digital spaces. Engagement and purpose lie at the heart of each online interaction users have with organizations. Becky's passion is pairing those user intentions and organizational priorities to tell stories through clients' digital spaces. Now, over to Becky.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. It's wonderful to join everyone today. Thank you for having me. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I know it's something that's on the minds of all of the members of MAR. And I hope to clarify some of the mystery around website accessibility and give you some good ideas for moving forward with more accessible websites in the future, and with some quick fixes for any problems you may be encountering right now. As Lauren said, we are going to have a question session at the end. I'm actually going to get through these slides in about 30 minutes. So we will have plenty of time for questions. If we do not get to every question, we are going to follow up with a response to your questions via the documentation you'll receive after this webinar. In addition, if there may be questions I can't answer in real time, and we're happy to research those questions for you and respond. As you may or may not know, fusionSpan is a technology partner of the Massachusetts Association of Realtors. We're working with Lauren and others to redefine the MAR website, and we look forward to talking with you today. The first thing I'd like to talk about is just a little bit of a story. Every user comes to your websites with a purpose and intention in mind. And I want you to imagine for a moment that instead of visiting a website, you're visiting a home. You're visiting a street address. You're at your office, you put the street address into your GPS, as we all do these days, and you're guided turn by turn to a location. You arrive at that house where your GPS has led you, only to find that there's no indication that you're actually where you belong. There is no house number. There's not one on the mailbox. There's not one painted on the curb. There's no house number painted on the side of the door or in those lovely brass numbers that we often see. So you're left with a bit of a mystery. Your GPS has led you to this exact spot. You believe that you're where you're supposed to be, but there's no indication to confirm that for you. The same is true for users who are visiting properties online. And users who have disabilities have very few tools in their toolbox to determine whether they're at the right house number. So accessibility guidelines are designed not only to help a user navigate a website, but to help them also determine that they are where they need to be. We're going to talk a little bit about the concept of accessibility and where it comes from. You may have heard the term WCAG. That stands for Web Content Accessibility, and it's a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 508. 508 compliance was the early stage of website accessibility for people with disabilities. And content accessibility guidelines are what lead us today in defining how users who may need assistance in navigating a website should be guided. There are 3 levels of compliance. There's single A, double A, and triple A. Most organizations have a goal of AA compliance. AAA compliance is often reserved for those organizations such as federal government agencies and organizations that are dedicated to those with impairment. It can be challenging to know which is right for you, but as many of you know, there is a new factor in considering whether you're compliant with these guidelines. In 2019, the Fair Housing Act added some requirements, and this is highly relevant for all of you today, and it's really the reason that we're here with you. The Fair Housing Act has suggested that sites like many of yours are the nexus to location, and the nexus to location places you with an additional burden of compliance for web content accessibility. Even though you may not be required just by virtue of the Section 508, now the Fair Housing Act has layered on an additional level of requirement. And that nexus to location is really about providing a user the ability to find and access a physical location. As you know, there are a lot of organizations who are struggling with this issue. There are a lot of ways to address it, and we're going to talk about those today. But first, I thought we'd talk a little bit about what constitutes a disability and what's covered. There are a variety of disabilities that we're all familiar with from the early days of the ADA, American with Disabilities Act. Visual impairment, of course, we often know as low vision or blindness. There's auditory disability, the deafness or some low hearing. Physical impairment, which might include things like some of the images you see on the right of the screen, a wheelchair or an inability to get in and out of a building. But physical impairment can also reduce a person's ability to interact with, for example, a keyboard or a mouse. So making a website navigable by a person who has this disability is part of compliance. There's also the concept of speech. There are devices that require speech to perform tasks on a website, and we can talk a little bit about those later. In addition to those sort of top 4 compliance areas for disabilities, there are additional compliance factors. They're cognitive, the ability to understand the content that's presented on a website, languages, that some organizations are required to support multiple languages. And then there are also learning differences and neurological impairments that may limit a person's ability to interact. And while there is a large school of thought about the limited ability to create a website for some of these impairments, the truth is creating a website that addresses everyone in this list makes your website better for every user. And we're going to talk about some of that as we move forward. There's a common myth that the myth of the minority means that the number of people who come to your site are fairly able to interact with it easily. They don't have a disability. If someone with a disability wants to interact with you, someone's going to do it on their behalf. And that's simply not true. With additional technologies and additional assistance, users who have disabilities make up 54%. And this was a 2011 number. 54% of adults living with disabilities do go online, and they do that independently. The number is only growing with the use of mobile technologies, tablet-style devices that give users new ways to interact. Now, recently, I know some of you have experienced some communications. You've received communications about challenges that you may be experiencing with your own websites. And some of the things that are listed here in this table may sound familiar to you. The number 1 issue with websites is low color contrast. That is something that many of us who are maybe on the other side of certain age ranges, like myself, can appreciate. The distinction between colors is very important in websites because viewports and different device types read color differently and present color differently. Having substantial color contrast can guarantee that users who are on a variety of different platforms, viewing through a variety of different tools, and who have low vision are going to be able to experience your site. Alternative text is another important factor, and it's one of the most commonly missing things. Alternative text is read by screen readers, and we'll talk about what those are shortly. When the screen reader encounters an image or a value on a page that can't be interpreted only through sight or only through hearing, it gives a description of that image, for example. Empty links, things that the user should be able to interact with but have no description. Missing labels, those are things like missing labels from buttons or missing labels from things like social media icons. Something I think a number of you have heard a bit about as well. Empty buttons that don't describe what the user can do when interacting with that button. And then missing document language, things that are left out or that are implied. All of these things are somewhat dependent on technology, but they're more dependent on the utilization of tool sets and sort of fostering and keeping care of the content on your site. Many organizations get their new website, they're happy with it, and as they add new materials to the site, new texts, new images, new documents and files, there are a lot of fields that are available in your tool sets, and sometimes we don't understand how we should be using those. So there is a burden on a developer to develop your site well. There's also a burden on an organization to be sure that you're taking advantage of all of the things that you can to support your users. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and especially the Q&A session. This is kind of a number that will not surprise some, but surprised me. How many sites actually fail AA compliance? Of 1 million home pages viewed, over 98% fail AA compliance. So with that number in mind, let's think about the percentage of the population who cannot interact with the majority of sites online. And even though there are some heavy burdens in gaining compliance for a web property or creating a website that from scratch that is compliant, there are tremendous advantages. What does it mean to be compliant? What does it mean to have an accessible website? First, the information and the interface has to be perceivable. We have to be able to view or hear or see the information on the website and understand what is the topic of conversation on this website, what we can do there, how we can interact, and the purpose of the site itself. It has to operate as intended. It has to function well. We all have encountered websites where a button didn't function, a link didn't function. That is also a factor in accessibility. And then it's also necessary to have enough content, enough reliable content and information so that your site is robust, so that the user is able to engage and understand just by visiting that site and not necessarily by digging deeper and deeper through the pages to understand the purpose of the site. In addition, robust means that it has to be deep enough content that a screen reader or assistive technology can understand it and interpret it. So what are some of the benefits? There's obviously a benefit in being compliant. Many of you have struggled with and really scrambled to gain accessibility or understand what you need to do in light of some of the actions that have taken place following the Fair Housing Act rule that came down in December. But there are some things that you benefit from that extend far beyond just accessibility. Number one is your site will immediately become more easily searched and more easily found. This is because the labels that are applied to the assets on your site are also searched not just by things like screen readers and assistive technologies, but also by search engines. The technologies that are used for assistive devices are the same technologies that allow Google, for example, to define your site based on its characteristics. In addition, users will find information more easily. Your site will be more intuitive. It will be more easily organized. It will be more easily navigated. And users will be able to consume and interact with content more easily. It's also the right thing to do. As we know, there are struggles for people who are living with disabilities, finding proper access points into buildings, safely crossing a road, having a job that's meaningful and productive, finding housing and having housing that's safe for them. So this is a step that we as website owners can take to ensure that we're doing the right thing and that we're also compliant. So, what are the steps to ensuring success and ensuring access? First, we have to start with content creation. Is the content you're focused on presenting on your website intuitive? Does it use common language that allows a user to interpret it? And that user could be assistive technology, or it could be an actual end user. There are some dependencies on tool sets and on development methods. This is an area I expect us to spend a little time on in the Q&A. Many of you are likely using content management systems to manage your website. Most contemporary content management systems have capabilities around accessibility. They provide accessible guidelines and standards. However, the tool set is only so good as the developers who are implementing it and on the end users who are populating the content into the site. So as an example, WordPress is a common tool set used for websites, and many organizations choose sort of out-of-the-box themes for their WordPress site. Many of those themes are beautiful. They have all the features that you desire. There are often out-of-the-box plugins that can be used in addition. However, not all of those themes support accessibility. So that should be, in addition to having it look like you want it to look, accessibility should be a guide when you're looking for that theme to use on your website. The same is true for many other platforms that come with theme-based approaches. If you are using WordPress or another similar tool and you have developers who are working with you to design a custom theme, or to heavily modify a theme, the burden is also on that developer to use good, structured development tools. You might hear words like semantic HTML or well-structured code. There are standards that are required when you're coding content pages, when you're coding a website header or footer. And in some cases, developers take shortcuts, or perhaps they're not aware of those standards. And the header and the footer of your website is really the first place that a user will look for guidance on how to interact with your website. So the standards and the accessibility guidelines are often heavily weighted in what appears in the header, for example. It is very valuable to test your website yourself, or to, at the very least, guarantee that your partner in developing your website is using a testing methodology. Many vendors test with out-of-the-box tools. You've probably seen some of these companies who offer services. They can install code on your website. They can install a plugin on your website, and it will report out the testing results. You can also choose to test by experiencing the site the way an impaired user would experience it. And I would encourage you, if you have not done this already, to look for a free screen reader and test your site using that screen reader. Every major operating system offers a free version of a screen reader. I use a Mac. We're going to talk in a minute about what those free versions are. I would just encourage you to look at those technologies and try using the screen reader yourself. It can be a little daunting at first. It's not the way we're used to engaging. However, it is a really educational experience in learning what's missing from a site, or how challenging it might be to understand a site based on just that audible screen reading technology. And again, we're going to talk about a few of those. The last bullet point here, the consistent use of authorizing and evaluation tools is really key. As you grow into your website, as you make changes, as versions change, as technologies change, it is important to have those mechanisms for ongoing testing. I do want to make a footnote here. If you believe that your site is not in compliance today, those evaluation tools may be great to help you validate that you have a problem, but they are not going to fix it. You are typically going to have to work with a third party to fix those issues, unless you have some facility among your own team to correct those issues. Let's talk for a moment about those assistive technologies. Again, assistive technologies are varied. They may be special keyboards that users can engage with that require limited mobility or tactile use for those who might have impairment in their hands. And let's think about that not only in terms of someone who's had a traumatic injury, but also just in terms of people who maybe are aging and are not as able to manipulate a keyboard or a mouse as they used to be. There are technologies that are special monitors that are designed for color contrast issues. Again, that might not be a person who has low vision. It might be a person who's colorblind. Other technologies, though, are really centered around this one concept of the screen reader. You'll hear this over and over and over again. Listed on the left side of the screen, you'll see some of the common assistive technologies. VoiceOver is the Mac free voice representative, and it's the free screen reader for Macs. There's one called NVDA that is more common for Windows operating systems, and the websites listed here will be provided after this session so that you can get a feel for how these screen readers work. There's also JAWS from Freedom Scientific, and a Chrome plugin, Chrome box. At fusionSpan, we use a plugin for Chrome called Access, and it provides us a rather technical look at the problems that may be occurring on a site. I would encourage you to consider tool sets that give you sort of in layman's terms, and we have some suggestions for those that we'll provide to you. It can be very hard to work through the technical jargon of an accessibility audit because the language used there is often developer specific. Also, I want to be sure that we're clear again that screen readers are not the only assistive technologies. They are the most common assistive technologies. And just to regroup a little, there are many benefits to accessibility beyond being in compliance. If your site is accessible, it means that your site has better accessible design. Your color contrast is appropriate, your images are meaningful, the styles are consistent, and that yields a better user experience across the board. Your page titles are better, they are more meaningful, they are relevant, and are able to be read not only by screen readers, but also by search engines. Header tags, in technical terms, page titles is another way to refer to that, are very high ranking in search engine optimization. In addition, they're high ranking when they're consistent with the content that's on the page. If there is a headline on a page that is not relevant to the content on the page, that is not only misleading for an impaired user, it's also misleading for a search tool, and the search algorithms will lower your status in search engine results as a result of that. Header structure, we talked about a little bit. Having a logo that is tagged and linked and has related text that describes what the logo means is very important. I'll tell you that the majority of websites feature their logo in the top left, and one of the reasons for that is accessibility and also search results. That top left is where, from a computer's perspective, the reading begins. And if that logo is in the top left, it's well tagged and linked, the screen reader is going to interpret immediately that the user is on the right site. Just like if you pull up in front of that house, you look up, you see the number is 1617, you know you're in the right place. Otherwise, you go into that site with some doubt and you may even drive away. In addition, menus are very important. Menus should be logical, they should be ordered, they should be relevant, natural language. We find in our work with information architecture that organizations sometimes like to use cute or sort of inspirational language in their menu. It is much more effective to have natural, logical, topical language in your menu. Search is also a factor. Search is often part of that header, and search can be something that's missed by a screen reader if it's not tagged appropriately. But if you do have search on your site, consider confirming that it uses natural search, natural language options. Natural language options allow you to type in a request such as, what houses are available in Silver Spring versus house plus Silver plus Spring. If you go back in the day of when I started out my life in technology, we talked about things like Boolean logic and searches that required some operators to be added to the middle of the search. Look for searches that have natural language. We all prefer those anyway. Think about your descriptive alternative text. Again, if you have an image on your page, provide alternative text and have it be relevant, not just image. Try white house, green shutters, green shingles, front-facing windows, large tree, driveway. You can tell I'm describing my own house there. Also, make sure that you have anchor text that helps the screen reader navigate through the page in a logical order. If you have videos on your site, consider video transcription. This does not have to be complete closed captioning. It can be a link to a readable file that contains the transcript of the video. For example, if you're doing a walkthrough for a home and there's an audio track on top of it, you'll want to transcribe that audio track for the hearing impaired. In addition, that transcription will provide information for a screen reader for the visually impaired. Next to the last bullet point, schema markup. What is that anyway? You'll see it often in references. Schema markup, schema is the ordering of things. It's the structure. So things that are structured according to how the page is laid out. I don't know if you've ever tried to tab through a page. It's a good exercise to try. Sometimes you'll find that you're tabbing through the page to each individual element on the page with which you can interact, and all of a sudden your cursor ends up at the very top of the page again. This happens pretty frequently. It happened in my review of some sites preparing for this session, and that often happens as changes are made during development or as you enhance your site into the future. Sometimes you may add an element. It's easier for the developer to just add it at the top of the code, or maybe somebody who's non-technical adds it at the top of the code, and that does not necessarily yield a logical pattern of navigation through the site. The last thing is site maps, and this is a little bit of a, this takes me back to the day when I was using things like Alta Vista to search for content on sites, and site maps were much more common. However, a site map is something that a screen reader can use to help a user understand the complete architecture of the site. It's also a great way for you as a site owner to understand the content that you have available to you on your site, understand where you have a great volume of content, understand where you may not have quite as much, and also understand how you want to define that organization of your site in the future. There's also another big benefit of accessibility. It's, as you can expect, it's mobile. Mobile accessibility is a type of accessibility. It's not part of the ADA standard. It's not part of it, and that does not mean that you are not required to have accessible sites on a mobile device. What it means is whether your site renders well on mobile and is responsive is not the simple demand of accessibility. However, all of the things that you do to improve your site, to make it more accessible, will also make it more responsive and more easily digested in a mobile device. The best practices, literally, and we're going to provide you a resource for this, the best practices for accessibility for mobile devices are the same best development practices for accessibility for disabilities. So those standards have sort of grown side by side. They grew up together. And that's something for you to consider. Being in the profession that you're in, I know that it's meaningful for you to have a highly accessible site, not only for those with disabilities, but also to have a mobile accessible device design site. Sorry. So if you're looking for someone to help you redefine the accessibility on your site and redesign your site, if you're looking to make a change, perhaps you found that your site is not accessible and you know that you need to do something quickly. Who should you look for? What are you looking for? You are looking for examples from a web vendor of AA accessible sites. And again, we have some links available for you that will define what AA accessible sites are. And AA accessibility is also something that you can define if you're doing any sort of assessment of your site. You want to see these examples and have the designer or vendor talk with you about what they did to make that site accessible. Don't let them gloss over it. Ask them to explain to you not only what they are doing as a developer to make your site accessible, but also ask them what you need to do to make your site accessible. We often have, I think I can share this information. We had conversations working with MAR about font colors and choices based on color contrast, and choices for how they link information in their site based on best practices for linking text. Your vendor should be talking with you about those choices. Also, go back and look at the sites that they give you as examples. Check them out with a screen reader. Download one of the screen readers and see how you interact with it. Again, it's a little daunting at first, but it will allow you to understand a little bit of how accessibility happens. Make sure they talk with you and that you understand before you sign off on your site what you as a site owner need to do to create and maintain an accessible site. What design choices do you have? Don't use red on dark blue text. That's an example. Make sure you always have alt text, alternative text when you're adding an image. Always add the alternative text. Don't bypass it. Also determine and know what content management system you're using, and just do a little bit of homework to make sure that that tool set is accessible. There are many platforms out there, many good platforms. And because there are so many that are so easily available today, many of them actually free, it can be a little hard to decipher which ones are best. But always check out reviews, look at sites that have been developed using these tools. And the last one, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but you may have to spend more time or more money maintaining your site. You're going to need that alternative text. You're going to need to make sure that you're hiring a credible vendor and not necessarily someone who can throw a site together for you quickly. You may be able to find that person who can also make your site accessible, but be a partner with them in making choices. Some of the examples, again, that we've talked about are, you may need to do things like make text available for audio files. That's time consuming. or create captions for video files. Make sure that you have testing in place and that you know how to make modifications. And also make sure that you're staying on top of alternative text for any images. And that includes not just pictures, but also, or photographs, but also things like information graphics or statistics that you're showing in an image. We have one more slide here on sort of what you can do next. You note that you got a survey. Answering those questions is going to help us answer your questions. But knowing the answer to those questions also helps you understand what some of your next steps can be. You are likely going to need to pick up the phone, possibly call the person who developed your site for you or the company who developed the site for you. I know many of you have already done that, and have a conversation about any concerns that you have. Even if you did not have that as a requirement when you first started your process for your current site, it is something that quality vendors should understand and know how to help you with. You may need to look elsewhere if your current vendor can't help you with that. Be prepared to find alternatives. I know that there are many of you and many organizations across the country who are considering whether they actually need to take their sites offline for fear of repercussions from non-compliance. If you're in that circumstance, think about your options. Do you have a way to create a robust Facebook presence? Do you have a way to start to engage your customer base on Instagram? Do you have YouTube videos that you can send your clients to so that they can learn more about the processes that they undertake with you? And also beef up your LinkedIn profile. There is no better alternative for business-to-business communication than LinkedIn profiles. The other last bit of advice that I have for you on next steps is really to look for standard technologies, engage with reputable firms. They may cost a little bit more, but it will cost you less in the long run. And sort of the last slide I have for you is really just a series of accessibility tools. We're going to include this in a set of materials for you, but I want to stop talking and give you some time for questions. I know I've talked a little longer than I intended to. And Lauren, I think that you have been collecting questions and may be able to tee some of those up for us.
Yes, we have a bunch of questions in the chat box, so let's just get right into it. So the first one is seeing a lot of GPS in directions. Is this allowed? Do you find it lacking?
GPS in directions, for example, when you're providing someone with directions to a location, that GPS routing is part of that? Is that the nature
I
of the
believe,
question?
and Maureen, let us know if I don't have this correct, but I think what she means is like when you go to a website and you just click on the link and it opens up the GPS directions versus just writing out the directions.
Right. So it is always best to have a written alternative to directions so that a screen reader can gather that. GPS is largely intended for people who are going to be navigating sort of visually on their own. So I would suggest that you always have a captioned version or a text-based version of directions turn by turn. This is it's sort of a backup plan. And if I haven't answered that question, Maureen, let me know and we'll respond more fully in our follow-up.
Okay, so the next question is, are you familiar with software that calls itself a full remediation service like Accessible? Does it create AA compliance?
Accessible is a service that can provide you with accessibility statistics on your own site, but there is no automation per se that can go through your site and make it accessible um, to the AA standard and without some choices and human interaction on your part or the part of a company like Accessible. So typically when you when you engage with someone like Accessible or Accessibility or some of these other firms, they're going to track your accessibility, they're going to notify you of the issues, and then they're going to come back and give you a quote for making the changes. So to my knowledge, there is no automation or service that will dynamically update your site to make it accessible.
Okay, that's good to know. So this next question is more about the why. So under most common issues, shouldn't compliance with those regulations be the responsibility of the website developer and provider and not the broker who has no real reason to be adept in technological techniques?
In my opinion, yes. And I say that as a web vendor. So I think that it can be a little tricky depending on whether you made that a requirement of your relationship with your vendor. As you know, statements of work and scope are always on the tips of our tongues. But I can tell you that a credible web vendor should always be talking with you about the level of compliance that you require for your organization. One of the first questions that we ask when we go into an organization is, are you required to be compliant? Are you required at the single A, double A, or triple A level? We have a couple of clients who are public health agencies. They're associations of public health agencies, I should say, and they are required to be compliant at the triple A level. So that is something that we knew immediately, and that we knew we had to account for in the designs that we gave. But yes, to answer your question, I think that it is a responsibility, but you would have to look back at your statements of work to be sure that that was accounted for. The one thing I would add is that this change in the Fair Housing Act, and Teresa Hatton and Leslie will tell you this, Lauren will tell you this, that change has really been a surprise for some web vendors. It was not something that would have enforced compliance on the types of firms that are here with us today. In 508 compliance, just purely 508 compliance, because there was a demand for the organization to receive substantial federal funding or to be a federal agency to require those levels of compliance. But this change in the Fair Housing Act has definitely had a dramatic impact. So it might also be a factor of when you forged the relationship with your vendor and what was in what was mandated at the time.
So this next question is about working with your provider. So we have a site hosted by Playster. I've been trying to work to make our website compliant. However, I'm limited by the tools they provide. I reached out to them, but they indicate that in the end, it's really our responsibility. Any ideas or suggestions?
I would love to know what tool set you're using, and we can follow up with that. But I will tell you that if you are working with a vendor partner, with a developer, there are things the developer has to do. We talked a little bit about the importance of your header. And it is often true that the structure of a header on a website is a developer task. It is sometimes an area that the end user, the owner of the site, has a very limited ability to affect. And for that reason, some of those top level items, like a well-labeled logo, or social icons that have proper labels and links may not be in your capability set. So I think I would go back and ask them, how would you like for us to change these things? I'm assuming that most people on the phone today are not developers. And I do believe that many of those things are developer level tasks.
Do we have to be concerned about MLS vow pages? I don't know that you would know what that is, Becky, but basically that's like a really big site. The MLS is where everybody goes to see houses and such, but it is not run by the real estate agents. It's a different entity.
Right. So I actually did review a number of these listing sites in preparation for this discussion. Technically, anything that you present through your site for the purposes of your business, for example, the listings that you're offering, you do have a responsibility to make sure it's accessible, but you really are limited in your ability to do that. I think that is something, I'm going to try to say this without getting myself in trouble here. I think that is something that the listing services would really need to consider. That is just right at the heart of that requirement in the Fair Housing Act for nexus to location. And the listing services that I see some of them are fairly good at allowing a user to tab through and see, for example, the location, the price, and some of the attributes of a home, for example, or a property. Where I think there's often a problem is in the image walkthrough. There's usually a slideshow gallery or a video walkthrough, and some of those things are the things I've seen typically lacking in alternative text. So I do believe that anything that you present through your site, you're subject to, even though it's not technically your web property.
So what's the best way to implement keyboard navigation or tabbing?
The key is to have your content be logical. This is especially true. I like to use forms as an example here because it's something that we do in order, right? So some websites are built, they sort of are built over time, right? You might launch the site with a certain set of features and then add as you go. And sometimes because you're adding as you go, things get out of order. You may add something that's at the bottom of the page, but from a code view, it is at the top of the page. So the screen reader is looking at the code level. And so implementing things in the right order, having them marked as links and as elements on the page is really the key to working with tabbed keyboard shortcuts. And the same is true for forms. Forms should always be labeled. That interest form that many of you have, the form should always be labeled with intuitive labels. Things like first name, last name, and they should be in order. I was just filling out a form and tabbing through this week, and the form actually started with the email address, but the email address visually looked like it was at the bottom of the page, but it had been added later. So it was added at the top of the code. So the key is just really keeping things in order. And sometimes that's just a matter of going back into the code and reordering it. It's probably, from a technical terminology, and my colleague Adam, who's on the line, will correct me if I'm wrong. But from a coding perspective, that's really about having good structured style sheets and good structured HTML. And that's something you should expect from your vendor.
So this is an interesting question. What about Facebook pages?
Facebook in and of itself is accessible. They are generally required to be. What you put on the Facebook page is really the key. So there are things that you can do to optimize. I think I'd like to share with you a resource, and I'm going to have to dig a little bit for this, on how to create Facebook posts that are the most accessible. There are always things that we can do as end users, and I'm not a technical person. I'm a content person, I'm a strategist. There are always choices that we can make that can render things less accessible, but I'll provide a resource for you on how to create highly accessible Facebook posts.
So there seems to be a little bit of a trend that agents are having a hard time working with their developers, that they think that their website is compliant, but it really isn't. Do you have any suggestions on how best they can work with their developer to make their website compliant and have them listen to their concerns?
First, I think that you can provide them with the list of concerns that you have, especially if you have that sort of technical rundown that I know some of you have done of your sites. But I would also make sure that they understand that there is a new mandate. Many developers do not understand that compliance at a AA level is required for many of your types of businesses. So I would make sure they understand there is a new requirement. The other thing that I would say is, excuse me, that have them show you how it is compliant. Have them engage you in a Zoom call, engage a screen reader, and have them show you. I will tell you from my own experience, and Adam can attest to this, even in our own team at fusionSpan, there is a wide variety of understanding about what accessibility is. I'll tell a quick story. My husband was just engaging with someone a week or so ago about making sure that their virtual conference platform was accessible. And the person on the phone, highly technical, very high up in the company, had zero idea that he was actually talking about accessibility for those with impairments. This person was 100% focused on the fact that it was mobile accessible. So make sure your vendors know what you mean by accessible. Tell them what standard you're working to, and validate with them that this is a requirement based on these guidelines that have been issued, and have them show you that it's accessible. And if it's not, if you're not confident, I think it's time for a new vendor. You need somebody who will listen to you.
Yes, I completely agree. So, is a similar question to that is, what do we do when our sites are provided to us by third parties, such as a website vendor, paid subscription, or from a franchise, and we don't have control over the formatting? So they're basically templated sites. Do you have any suggestions for that?
It really comes down to making sure that you're working with a service provider that is guaranteeing accessibility. Some of the platforms that they may be using may not, they may not be accessible platforms. So knowing what that platform is, pushing back on them about accessibility, and explaining to them, where you're coming from. And this, the current situation is going to be important. But I did, this is something that I experienced as I was looking through some of the sites that, are areas of concern, that some of these are coming from services. And what sometimes those may actually be provided through an association or through a local organization, and probably going to the top of the of that organization and explaining that this is now a requirement and that they have to, there is a demand to implement it. And to be sure that the sites are accessible is going to be your best path, because I imagine that if it has not been done to this point, going through the developer resource in a large, service provider like that may not be your best path. You may have to go to leadership.
And kind of attached to that as well, do you have a list of reputable ADA compliant web developers in case my vendor isn't and won't make the necessary adjustments?
We certainly do. I think some of it comes down to your to the tool sets that you'd like to work with, and this is a key that I want to an important point for us to kind of close out on, and that is understand what you on your team want to have in your hands. What do you intend to do with your website in the future? And then structure your relationship with your vendor around that. Do you want to take a lot of ownership for content, or are you going to be looking to that vendor to do really everything for you? But yes, we can provide you with a list of firms that we are aware of that are highly reputable. What I can't say off the bat is what the cost is of that. But there are a number of firms. I can also give you a list for those of you who are using WordPress themes. I can give you a list of WordPress themes that are the most widely accepted accessible themes.
Okay, and so it looks like we're at 11:02, but I want to go a little bit longer because we have so many questions and I want to be able to get through as much as we can. So this is another great question. It's a two-part question. Is there a formula for alt text to be compliant? And if you embed a video from YouTube or Vimeo, can you add captions, or does that have to be done by the creator?
You can add captions after the fact, but not to the original source file of the video. I'm going to start with the last question first. The way that you would do that is to create a separate caption content block that the user would use instead of the video itself, so that they could follow along. And there are best practices for creating alt text. Again, the key is descriptiveness and relevance. So describing what is in an image and making it relevant to the content on the page is important. So it's not just a matter of of describing that the house is white, it has green shutters, but also placing it in the form of context. For example, the house that is for sale at 1617, blah, 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 is white with green shutters. So relevance and context are really the most important.
So this question has already been answered, but it seems like a lot of people keep asking it. So I just want to reiterate. Is there an accessibility tool that audits your website to inform you of any issues?
There are many accessibility tools, and we'll provide a list of those. Access is the one that we use. There are others that focus on specific issues like contrast checkers. I have a huge list of those that I can provide to you. They're actually provided through the website accessibility office of the federal government, and there's a long list there of accessibility checkers that we can offer you, and they are free.
When testing and using screen readers, will there be differences between, say, an NVDA and voiceover behavior reading the site, and how do you manage those differences?
There is a slight difference. It's more in the quality and the options that you have for speeding up, for slowing down. It's more features than it is actually the content of the reading. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any situations where there is where non-compliance has been associated with a lack of performance on one screen reader or another. The screen readers have to meet a certain level. There's actually an association that dictates that, for an Association for Assistive Technology, and they actually dictate the standards. So they are all working to the same standard, and I'm not aware of any situations where because a screen reader in an NVDA reading was different or perhaps less substantial than a voiceover, that there was an issue of non-compliance.
How should we determine if we need to be A compliant or AA compliant?
Well, from what I have seen, and I am not an attorney, but from what I've seen, the Fair Housing Act is pushing toward a AA compliance versus single A, and the AA compliance is the standard for which web development firms, reputable web development firms, hold as their minimum standard. So I would definitely shoot for AA.
So the 2019 Fair Housing Act states that we need to add nexus to location, providing the user the ability to find and access a physical location. How should we do that?
There are two ways to do that. One is to make sure that the location, that your physical location of your facility has, for example, maybe you have a map that's embedded in your that's embedded in your site. You need to be sure there's alternative text that describes where you're located, and your address to your facility is readable by a screen reader. So that's one. Number two is that any listings that you have on your site that have a physical address or location or directions is also available to a screen reader. So those two things are the most common nexus to location.
Any thoughts for those that use Weebly?
I don't have specific thoughts on Weebly, but I'll be happy to. I did look a bit at Wix and at, and of course WordPress and Drupal, but I'd be happy to take a look at some of the documentation around Weebly and make some recommendations. To the best of my knowledge, it offers capabilities around compliance, but again, it does depend on how it's implemented. As I said to a coworker, we can take a tool set that supports accessibility and make it inaccessible as developers. So that's always something to consider. But I will take a look at Weebly and we'll follow up.
How does one describe a house verbally when the listing is through the IDX?
Lauren, can you explain IDX to me, please?
So I believe it is like a listing through the MLS that kind of comes on their website. How do they verbally describe that house that comes through that other entity?
Got it. So the one option is to create what we call interstitial pages that provide a landing page for that home or that listing, and then provide the text there. So essentially for every listing, you're providing a description, a page that has a description or a page that has a list of descriptions. But in terms of the MLS, I think there's probably a strong argument for reaching out to the providers of the services and asking what accessibility capabilities they have for things like closed captioning.
Okay, and we have a question about Squarespace. Is there any concerns about that? I don't know if you know Squarespace.
I do. Adam, I'm not sure if you know Squarespace better than I do.
Yeah,
I don't. Have you worked with Squarespace?
I personally haven't. No, I can. Again, it's another one that we can pull up, look into, and send out more information about that. But off the top of my head, no, I do not.
So I have not worked with Squarespace, but I'm very familiar with it. We work with many small nonprofit organizations who choose Squarespace as their platform and provider. I don't know of any specific concerns around Squarespace, but other than those that we've talked about with other tool sets, which is anything that you can sort of modify or customize or configure heavily, even if it's accessible out of the box, can be made inaccessible. And whenever you're using themes, that's also an issue. You have to make sure the theme is accessible.
Okay, and it looks like we have time for one more question. Let me see. Will the third-party vendor be held responsible for liability for not offering AA compliant templated websites, or just us?
You know, that's a legal question that I don't feel confident answering. All I can tell you is what I've seen, and that is that it's typically the organization who is the owner of the website and not the third party. If the third party vendor was responsible, it would have to go back to the contractual relationship that you have with the third party. So if that vendor promised to provide you with an accessible site at a certain standard and did not, then there would be a path to sort of remediation with that vendor. But to the best of my knowledge, all compliance for accessibility is associated with the domain holder and the owner of the site.
Well, I don't want to hold this too long because I know you all have important things to get back to. But it looks like we did get through most of our questions. If we didn't answer anything that was really important to you, we have all of the questions saved. We're going to look at those afterward, and we're going to try our best to get back to you. As a reminder to everyone, this webinar has been recorded and will be available to view in the next few days on our website at marealtor.com. It's also on our YouTube channel, and we should be sending an email after the webinar with all the links so you can have easy access. So thank you so much, Becky, for your presentation, and thank you everyone for joining today. We hope you learned a lot, and we hope to see you all next time.
Thanks very much.